When last we left off from before, we were talking about combined threats. So as you look at the 6 types of threats that we talked about, it's possible that we can, more than one of those things can be at work in any given study. Selection history effects, for example, could be present in any study. Mindful of the events of yesterday, it could well be that if you're looking at a longitudinal study, you will see a big difference in, say, anxiety, relief, or general levels of emotion and affect, depending on who you are from yesterday. And, selection attrition is also an issue. Attrition effects, if they happen across both conditions, can result in different estimates of what the treatment are. Maybe selection effects can operate in only one of your conditions, as I was mentioning the last time, if you have people on a diet regimen, and it's really, really hard. It's likely that those people might drop out. So these are just 2 examples of what can happen. And as you think about, you're reading through the chapter and the examples, these are things that, you can kind of play a game and think, is there a way that I can combine some of these 2? The next thing that I'd like to turn to is internal validity threats. And we've talked a little bit about these. Observer bias can certainly affect the data that you're going to gather. And this is very difficult, especially when you're doing an observational study and you are recruiting other professionals in the area, graduate students and postdocs to do your study, or when you're recruiting undergraduate research assistants and you're equating them with the literature. It's the case that bias can happen because people know what results the researcher is kind of expecting. Observer biases also relate to demand characteristics. Move the chat out of the way here. That if you are giving someone a medication, the very act of giving them a medication, if you know that that is the medication that's going to be, supposedly efficacious or maybe has side effects, might influence your behavior in the assessment. So sometimes you can think of this as being in the service of angels. You might say, well, if I know I'm giving the person this medication and I want to be really, really careful and sure to note all the side effects, if I knew that the person is getting the medication, I might be tempted to say, are you really sure? Here's some examples of what side effects might be like. And if the person's receiving a sugar pill instead, I might go, well, we're supposed to ask you for side effects. And here we are, and even though you might not say it quite like I did, in the back of your mind, you might not be in the mood to really aggressively inquire of the person about what their experiences are. Placebo effects we've talked about in previous chapters. Sometimes placebo effects are, you can kind of tell you're getting the sugar pill. Some of my friends were involved in the clinical trials for the COVID vaccine, and they knew after they had the shot, their shoulder didn't even hurt. So they had some pretty strong beliefs that this placebo, that this essentially saline water solution that they got probably wasn't the real vaccine. I mean, to the extent that you can make a placebo be believable, though, you can, control for this type of effect. I mean, what are some other examples of placebo effects? Sometimes you may see on the street, in the time of COVID, we're doing less of this, but we do alcohol challenge studies. And we might be interested in knowing how people perform in the lab after they've had alcohol and how they perform in the lab if they think they have had alcohol. So, we're going to both give you a drink, but of course you can tell if you're just getting tonic water without any alcohol in it, or if you're getting tonic water with some vodka mixed into it. And for that reason, the clinical procedure is a double-blind one. The researchers doing the study don't know if they're administering alcohol or not. They take a flask out of the refrigerator and they mix the tonic water and they put something from another flask into it. But then to assure that the subject at least has some of the sensory experience of alcohol, they take a spray bottle out and they spray a little bit of alcohol on the top of the water so that when you drink it, you can kind of smell that alcohol smell. And so as a result, if you, in the placebo effect that you're getting, might think that you're getting alcohol and behave differently just because you believe you consumed it, that's, a way to control for that expectation on the part of the person as opposed to the physical effect of getting alcohol. Any questions on that? So graphically, this is what it looks like. Now, it might be the case in some situations that you have a real therapy and placebo therapy, and if you think you're getting something, maybe it's the case that you're going to get better over the course of time just because you think you're receiving some kind of a therapy. And the real therapy is hopefully larger. The only thing that, again, I mentioned last time is that placebo effects, when they're present, really make statistical significance in your model somewhat more difficult to ascertain, because if there was no placebo effect, you are looking at a main effect, that the blue line would be horizontal in terms of symptoms. And that's a lot easier. You're looking at the post-test difference score between true therapy and placebo therapy, and the space between those is a lot larger. If it's the case that you have a main effect for post-test, that is, that at post-test rating, people go down, it becomes a little more difficult for you to find statistical significance for that difference. And generally speaking, what you're looking at in a three-armed study is what they call it, where you're doing no therapy, placebo therapy, and true therapy, is that you would see some kind of a change due to the placebo effect, and the no therapy group would stay more or less the same. And that's just generally what that looks like. Now, at the end of the day, we've talked about all of these threats to the internal validity of the study. And you might think, when I read journal articles or when I hear about them in the news, should I really even believe them at all? And just to rehearse, we've got our 6 threats that we have going on here. And especially with the alternate hypotheses of maturation and history, you might wonder, do I really believe the results of this study? I mean, I don't know how it was for you, but the pandemic, let alone the 24/7 continuous news cycle of the previous president, led to a lot of emotional upset, and the strident discord in the conversation in the country kind of led to a general anxiety. Well, if you're doing longitudinal studies in the course of that epoch of time, to what extent might they actually carry over to what we have now, or what went on before that presidency and before these recent events? So let's take a look at each of these 6 things in turn and talk a little bit about what you might look for in an article to give yourself some sense that maybe those types of things could exist, but the researchers at least tried to do their best to answer these questions of a reasonable skeptic. One of the things that I'm a little leery about in the book, because I think she doesn't want to open up how ugly science can get over the course of time, is that at the end of the day, in any given study, you need to evaluate it not in terms of its claims. In other words, I think there's an association claim here, or this therapy is helpful, but more in terms of the question, as I look at this, does this explanation take into account the counterclaims that a reasonable skeptic could offer? This goes way back to the first few times I was talking to you, that when we do science, we're not proving things. We're doing critical tests, which, if true, if they hold, will overthrow our existing theory and force us to do some other kind of theory. And if our experiment passes that test, if our theory survives after that, we don't necessarily know that our theory is more true or is better validated even. We just know that the theory that we are currently working on is the one that's left standing after, in light relative to all of the other candidates that we have. So let's look at the first one, design confounds. So when you have a design confound, there's some other variable out there that's unintentionally varying with the independent variable that you have. So, her example in the book is if people who took notes on laptops answer harder questions than those who took notes longhand, then you had some kind of a design confound. If you think about it, one of the ways that the placebo effect is similar to a design confound is if you do a study where you have a no therapy group and a therapy group, or a no medication group and a medication group, and you don't have that placebo in there, what you're thinking about as the treatment effect, as the effect of the medication, is really, here comes Isa, is really due to the fact that people come into your experiment with expectations about what therapy is like. So the third variable there, that second variable that unintentionally varies with the independent variable, is what goes on in the head of people when you tell them, oh, you're in a study and we're not giving you any pill, we're not giving you any therapy at all, versus we're giving you some kind of a therapy, and you create the psychological expectation on the part of your participant that something will be going on. When you're looking at a study more generally, did these researchers try to control for potential third variables in your study? So one of the things I talked about way back in the day when I was helping out in some of my first studies was whether the presence of a co-actor reduces the anxiety of people. And in one condition, this was a study had been done earlier at the University of Iowa, where they had people with a Confederate filling out a survey, and in the other condition, people fill out a survey alone, and then in the second condition, they had them get up and walk down the hall and meet with the Confederate. And the reduction in anxiety that people had, the researchers wanted to claim it was due to the presence of somebody else in the room. But maybe getting up and walking down a hall and going to a new place is itself a little anxiety reducing. So that's an example of a design confound. So in selection effects, if you've got an independent group's design, treatment and experiment, maybe some people are more willing to go into your study than others for some of your conditions. So in the book's example, if you're in this autism study and some parents insist they want their kids to be in the intensive treatment and they don't want them in the control group, to the extent that you respond to that, or to the extent that you just say, well, okay, we'll let you into this experience, but we're not letting you into our study, that's going to introduce a confound. Now, in some cases, for human ethics situations, you don't have the luxury of saying, I'm going to let these people in and not those people. You can try to match the groups. That is, you can take all of the people you have, and if they insist on being in your study, that's fine. But we will have somebody else who is very much like you in every other respect, and we're putting them in the control condition. You know, random assignment, you know, if you can do it, is also good. So when you're reading the study, it's important that, you know, some statement be made in the methods section. Did they randomly assign? Did they match? The other thing that you can do to provide some information to a reasonable skeptic is to make a table in your paper about how the people in your treatment condition and your control condition performed on various remaining background information. One of the things that we do here in our department to talk about what selection effects might be is, you know, if you might recruit people in person, you might recruit them in a mail-in questionnaire, you might recruit them on the internet. If they tell you they don't want to be in the study, you say, that's fine. I completely understand that. But here's a little 3x5 note card, or here's a single little page with 3 questions on it. Could you just give us this information? And that information might be sex of participant, maybe the zip code that they're from, and, you know, just some very, very basic demographic information. And that then becomes useful in telling you as a researcher, if you have some selection effects going on to the population that you're looking at, or maybe even treatment versus control in terms of their basic descriptive information. Giving out zip code is really, really useful because you can turn around and take that zip code and match it up with census information. And there's a lot of census information out there. So we can take a zip code and map that to a census area and get information about how many 2-parent income households are there, what is the average education level of these people, the ethnic composition, the percent of individuals receiving public assistance, the percent of young women who, you know, give birth during adolescence. You know, it provides you with a really huge amount of information about the community from which you came. I've got a paper out under review where, you know, the original question that we asked of Missouri students was, what is the zip code of your hometown you came from? And that, coupled with the answers people gave on questionnaires, coupled with information that's available from the Mizzou institution, gives you an awful lot of data that doesn't cost a lot to collect. I mean, with just a zip code, you immediately got access to an awful lot of information that could tell you about selection effects. Any questions about design confounds or selection effects? Okay, the last one on this slide is order effects. So if we're looking at repeated measures designs and there are order effects, that is carryover effects from one condition to another, you know, you need to think about if that's present. If order effects are really, really pronounced and there's nothing you can do about them, you might make this a between groups aspect of your design. So you can't put people through, say, 3 or 4 different therapies. You might have to say, I'm going to do a study and some people will get this therapy, some people will get that therapy, or some people will get this medicine, others will get that medicine. In the case where carryover effects exist and they are not huge, a researcher can counterbalance the order. And the other thing that we talked about was using a Latin square. So if I had 3 levels, ABC, BCA, CAB, being 3 different orders that at least assure that people are hitting each of these conditions an equal number of times as the first, second, and third condition. So come on down here. Maturation. That is, as individuals are assessed over time, do they spontaneously improve? Do they spontaneously change? So if you're looking at children in school and you're looking at math ability, it's the case that their math ability will change over the course quite naturally, just because as children get older, they get better at these things. The example that she's talking about here are boys in a camp situation, and that's a really short-term maturation thing that people just kind of settle down in their behaviors over the course of time. And if that's the case, do you have a comparison group that would account for maturation? Looking at longitudinal studies like this camping one is also important, because you can tell if there might be differential maturation. That is, some people might change a little bit and other people might change a lot. And you can look at the pre and post test scores of each individual person and note, for example, that maybe some people come in somewhat disruptive and they settle right down, and other individuals come in at a very high level and they change only a little bit. That itself might be an individual difference in maturation that you would be interested in looking at as a researcher. History effects, talked about here. History effects are really hard to evaluate in the context of a research study, mainly because often a journalist writing the paper or the researcher reporting on it neglects to tell you, exactly when the study got done, what years, what went on. Often, if you're looking at these types of data and history effects are present, maybe it's the case that you need what's called a qualitative arm of the study. That is, some conversation, informal conversation with the participants in your study about what the experience was like going through their study. And it's there that you'll find that kind of information. It's not often looked at, though. And it is something, hopefully, maybe you can get at differential history effects indirectly by looking at replication, that we're going to go on to later chapters. Okay, now this third one that I kind of talked about is regression to the mean. Regression to the mean is a statistical artifact. That is, whenever you're reading a test question or when you're reading a study, and it's the case that change happens from one testing to the next, but it is due to measurement error. And your key clue here is maybe it's those individuals who were extremely low or extremely high at one point in time, and upon retesting, they appear to recover. That's different than maturation. Maturation is real, true change in the person's score. So, as I was looking over test items and so forth, you'll see an example of a study and you'll be asked, is this maturation or is it regression to the mean? And it's exactly that issue, that regression to the mean is a statistical artifact. It has to do with measurement error in the study. Regression to the mean effects are going to be more prone for variables that have low reliability than studies that have high reliability. Now, sometimes if you're looking at an extreme behavior, regression to the mean is going to be a fact of life. So if you wish to control for this regression to the mean effect, you need to be assured that the people you have in your conditions are somewhat comparable. For example, in the Psych 1 pool at Mizzou, there are some individuals who report eating disorders. They are relatively rare in terms of the general population, but individuals who endorse these things, given the instruments that we have, they're not really crappy instruments, they're fairly respectable ones, But regression to the mean will be a concern. So if you pre and post test individuals with eating disorders, there may be a lot of change in that, a lot of spontaneous recovery, or, as I mentioned, a false positive that an individual counts as extremely distressed, and really upon retesting, they will no longer demonstrate that. If you're designing your study and you're going to put people into treatment and control conditions, one way to try to control for regression to the mean effects is to assure yourself that you have people at the same levels across the treatment and control groups. Okay, so I'm a little just informally talking with people. I want to be sure that those distinctions are kind of nailed down. So attrition, as you're looking at attrition, is what happens when people drop out of your studies, and maybe they drop out depending on whether they're in treatment and control, or maybe people have attrition because of their behaviors. In her example, maybe rambunctious kids are asked to leave the camp because they're really unruly, and so they're in the pre-test, but they're not in the post-test. A researcher can answer that question by doing their analysis based on complete records. You can also take into account whether, in terms of attrition, whether people are actually conforming to the experimental condition. Sometimes, for example, if you're trying to improve people's diet, oh yeah, they say they're in the experimental condition, but and they'll write down in their daily diary, what did you have to eat? Oh, leaves, and vegetables, but really they're not telling you the truth. So, to the extent that you can monitor or put some controls in there, attrition and compliance are things that are important to look at when you see the write-up of the study. Testing effects. My goodness, when we do cognitive assessments, it takes people about 3 to 4 hours to do them. And order effects are very important. So when you're looking at testing effects, do you try to counterbalance for them? Do you build into your study some pauses, some breaking up of the experience so that people don't get bored out of their skulls or so tired that they really don't want to put any more effort forward? Some of this is a judgment call when you write it up. You'd say, hey gang, we know that it's a lot of work to administer a cognitive test to people. And sometimes the effect of the test has an effect on things because the second time that you look at something, you go, oh yeah, that's the one I looked at before. Now that come to think of it, now that I've seen it the second time, I do know the answer. So use of alternative forms is also helpful for that. Instrumentation effects, also known as radar drift, or changes in your measuring instrument. The example that I gave was high school grades change over the years of Missouri high school and in your states. And the interpretation of the variable might not be the same as it was and as it is now. You can deal with that somewhat by having regular times where you when you read the write-up, are they maintaining the training of their raters? Sometimes in other studies, especially if you're rating transcripts or if you're rating videos, you save all the videos and then you mix up the order of them, whether they're pre and post test, and have the raters rate that, because then hopefully the time of measurement is no longer confounded with the raters. This makes your study more expensive to do because it's going to take you longer to get your rating done, but it controls for instrumentation effects. And we just got done talking about observer bias, demand characteristics, and placebo effects. And as you read through the study, the right-hand column is what you're going to be wanting to look at. that namely, did you keep people unaware of what conditions people are in, your research staff, and do you keep the participants unaware of the purpose of the study and what conditions they're in? And the placebo effect is this a believable placebo that people are getting? So, excuse me. So are there any questions about these threats? That was a half hour of me talking fairly quickly. Sometimes when you're doing your study, hey, you know what? We didn't find any differences between the groups. And the book, the chapter does kind of a nice job talking about this issue, that maybe there really is no big groups difference going on. And maybe the variation inside each of these groups is so large that we didn't find our group differences. And maybe there's no difference at all. Null effects can be hard to find. And the other thing that's talked about is it's very hard to do a study, find no differences, and then go to a journal and say, hey, big, great news. There's no differences here. Visually speaking, we're looking at 3 differences here. And what we're finding here in the first chart A is we're giving people some money, and we're looking at whether this affects their happiness on the next day. And I guess it's important to take a step back and look at this and say, well, the vertical bars that we're seeing here have the error bars associated with them as well. And the error bars are so large that there is no differences between the means of the no cache, some cache, and a lot of cache condition. Now, as she talks about in the book, maybe if when you're talking about some cache and a lot of cache, well, that's relative to the cost of doing a study. Maybe the amount of money that you're actually giving people isn't getting people too excited. And therefore, the amount of happiness your next day is a very slight amount, or perhaps not that much. And that might be one reason. The other reason that you'd see a lot of differences going on here and no significant effect is there might be an awful lot of variation within each of your 3 groups. So say, for example, you did a really well-controlled study, but the individuals in your study vary in terms of their overall level of happiness, or they vary in terms of their income levels. Well, if you have people that vary a lot in terms of their happiness, the variation, the standard deviation around the means in each of these conditions is going to be quite large. Therefore, it will be harder, these error bars that you have are based on the variance and the sample size you've got going on. And if the variance is large, those error bars are going to be commensurately larger. Therefore, it's going to be harder for you to find statistical significance based on happiness. If somehow you can control your study, if you can say, I'm going to do a study where, say, I'm going to match on happiness level pretest, and I'm going to select only individuals who score 50 on my happiness measure and then throw them in these 3 conditions. Or I'm going to take individuals at varying levels of happiness and then come back and make sure I've got each of those people in each of these 3 conditions. That will allow me, in the first case, to have very small standard deviations because on pretest they all have the same happiness level. And in the case of matching, as we talked about a couple of lectures ago, I can use that pretest match score as a covariate, and I can adjust those scores down and thereby reduce the variance in each of the conditions. And therefore, I will be able to get some kind of a statistical significance. Make sure I've covered everything that we've got going on in here. I think that, she gives these 3 examples of reading and reading scores and whether it's online or control and anxiety levels and scores and logical reasoning, but each of these are possibilities. So to go a little more specifically into there not being a lot of within groups difference, our vocabulary here is, maybe it's a weak manipulation. So if I'm giving people money amounts of 50 cents and $1, maybe that's not enough to really affect your happiness level the next time. Insensitive measures has to do with the fact that maybe your measure is measuring in units that are too large. So, maybe a physical analogy is if I'm trying to do physical measurements of people's height and I have a measure that's measuring miles, that's not going to really be a useful measurement. Similarly, if I'm using a psychological measure, maybe my happiness measure is something that will discriminate people who are so terribly unhappy as to need therapy from those who are more run-of-the-mill. Well, that type of a measure isn't going to work too well if I'm giving out money to people, mainly because the instrument isn't designed to measure differences that are of the small effect size that I'm looking for. We've talked about ceiling and floor effects, that if you've got a test and there's 100 questions on it and you answer 95 of them correct, you're not going to gain 20 more points because there's only 100 questions on the test. It's not physically not possible for you to get anything higher than 5 more points. That's called a ceiling effect. And similarly, if you have a measure and you score at the bottom of it, you get nothing right, or you talk about the fact that nothing is making you happy at the moment, there's a physical number at the bottom of your scale below which you cannot go. So if you have floor effects, you can't really decrease your score much beyond that. The insensitive measures and the ceiling and floor effects are properties of your test. So, if you're looking at exactly what the measurement instrument is, these are the things that you need to look to evaluate whether ceiling and floor effects are possible. So you need to kind of do a deep dive on that. Manipulation checks. You have probably seen in surveys you've taken that you want to make sure that the manipulation that you did is really the one that was delivered. Manipulation checks, if you want to know the effect of having someone read a story about a person's first few months at Missouri and the challenges or the positive experiences they had, one of the manipulation checks you might have is, did you read this? And another one would be, depending what your constructs are, does this person feel happy, or do you think that this person is likely to stay at Mizzou based on their experiences? You can detect whether your manipulation has been too weak. Manipulation checks are a little bit harder to find ceiling and floor effects. I'm not exactly sure why she believes this is the case, unless you were doing a manipulation check that was an interview. And design confounds can sometimes act in reverse for the reasons that we mentioned here above. Now, she goes through and talks about examples of ceiling and floor effects. And if the bar chart helps you here, getting higher on this one is not going to be an option, and getting lower on these is also not going to be an option. And ceiling and floor effects can happen on both independent and dependent variables. So when you're looking at manipulation checks, if you're administering people into 3 different groups, and they're supposed to be a high, low, medium, and high anxiety group, and you're asking how anxious they are, your means can tell you if you are actually manipulating things the way you think you are manipulating them. Over here on the left, you're not. Over here on the right, you are. And sometimes your confound can act in reverse. As we talked about, maybe confounds threaten internal validity. Sometimes a design confound can cause a null effect. So in this example of do coactors make you less anxious? Maybe we did that study and we found that, oh, there's no effect. Well, perhaps having people get up and walk down a hall in a building that they don't know about and go into a new room they've never been before actually raise anxiety. And so even though presence of a coactor might help, actually this confound that you had of walking down the hall of a lab research building was a confound that caused you to find no effects between the anxious and the non-anxious people. I have just a few more slides here. I would